Legend of Exorcism. Chapter 59. Like an illusory dream. Lu Su dash. The sky had completely darkened, and Hung Jun looked around him, completely lost. He loudly shouted Lu Su's name, but he couldn't get any response. Lu Su. How about we go back, the Carpiao urged. It's so cold. How could we? Hung Jun replied worriedly. He'll freeze to death. Even you're complaining that it's cold, he's wearing so little, and he doesn't have a phoenix plume. The Carpiao wailed, bundle up my legs well first, why don't you? Haven't I bundled them up already? The other side sticking out. Hung Jun tucked the Carpiao against his chest, looking all around him. With a shake of the reins, he dashed towards the mountain range looming ahead. Where would he go? In this snow-covered landscape, Lu Su had been on foot, he would freeze to death in the span of a single night. Hung Jun turned his horse and headed northwest for a bit, and a short while later, he found a line of shallow footprints. That was him. Hung Jun immediately followed that line of footprints. Logically, with Lu Su on foot and himself on a horse, he would be able to catch up in less than 2 km, but those footprints zigzagged towards the end of the plains, vanishing into the horizon. No way, how could Lu Su run this fast? Hung Jun chased him for a good half a shishan, using his pentacolor sacred light to light up the snowy ground in front of him. Suddenly, he found that the footprints disappeared at one spot, and a line of hoofprints snaked from the other side, replacing those footprints, heading into the distance. No way. What did this mean? Hung Jun suddenly remembered that Lu Fei had left at about the same time. Had it been him? The sky was chilly, the ground was cold, and a snowstorm swept across the plains. Lu Fei spurred his horse onwards, galloping across the plains, with Lu Su sitting behind him. What are you going to Dunhuang for? Lu Fei asked, turning his head. But Lu Su only stubbornly refused to say anything. Lu Fei said, go back ba, you're not afraid that wolf god boy will be worried about you. Up high, on the ridge of the mountains, a woman wearing black clothing quietly watched the plains. A youth wearing a black outfit stood by her side, and his face was actually identical to Lu Su's. He too stared down at the snowy plains. Can you make Lu Fei go back to sleep for a little? The black-robed woman asked. The black-robed youth responded quietly, it can't be done. He has already woken, so I cannot approach him. We can only wait for him to enter sleep once more. Suanu, who is that person sitting behind him? The black-robed woman who had just been called Suanu replied, I haven't seen him before. It seems to be that child that the plague god mentioned. Oh well, I'll act now. With that, Suanu swept her long sleeve across, drawing out an arc in the air. A sudden snowstorm instantly swept out, blanketing the sky and the earth like a waterfall of snow, overturning Lu Fei and the other rider on the horse. Lu Fei let out an angered roar, rising from the snow with the wind sword in hand. With a graceful turn, Suanu swept open her long sleeve, flying towards Lu Fei. It's you! Lu Fei cried. The black-robed youth shifted forms into an inky stag, leaping through the air as he raced towards the plains that had been covered by the avalanche. When Lu Su had been swept away by that snow, he had immediately fainted. The stag lowered his head, black energy wreathing around his antlers that twined around Lu Su, dragging him out of the piled-up snow. Right after, the deer took human form again, observing Lu Su lying on the ground. The two of them looked exactly the same, as if they were a pair of twins. Li Jinglong and Emorigen exited the city gates, having taken a torch to light the way, racing furiously along as they followed the hoofprints of Hung Jun's horse. Li Jinglong roared angrily, Hung Jun. Where is he? The Carpiao had already fallen asleep in Hung Jun's arms. Hung Jun had galloped along for almost an entire night, and snow had gathered everywhere, along the mountain ridges and across the plains. The flowing silver river joined the dark night sky with the vast land, and this realm seemed to be wholly silent. There was no snowstorm nor wind, and the world was an expanse of endless gray. Hung Jun felt as if he was racing along within a dream that had no end. In front of him was a patch of dense white fog. After Hung Jun entered and then exited it, the plains that were completely covered with snow seemed like an ink painting under Chu Yangxi's brush. All around him were large patches of blank white, so white that they looked like parchment that hadn't touched even a speck of dust. There were only the mountains in the distance that looked like they had been touched by a small amount of spreading ink, so light in color that they were almost the same color as the night. After passing through the fog, the hoof prints on the snowy ground had completely disappeared. Behind the fog was a calm, quiet cemetery. The stars overhead began to dim. To one side of the graveyard was a small wooden house for the gravekeeper to live in, and there was a light within. The wood faintly dimmed that light, and Hung Jun, leading his horse along by the reins, approached steadily, only to hear Lu Fei's voice coming from inside. Madam now always liked to say, "Your Highness, that you shouldn't kill any more people." Hung Jun pushed open the wooden door. In the room, Lu Fei was currently sitting on the ground to one side, while Lu Su laid on the bed. The stove on the ground had been lit, and the room was warm. The two of them turned their gazes towards him in unison. He had finally caught up to him, thank the heavens. Lu Su was wearing a black outfit, lying down fully robed, and he said, "Hung Jun, why have you come?" Lu Fei asked, confused. Hung Jun disregarded Lu Fei's question, instead sitting down on the edge of the bed, frowning. "Why did you leave just like that?" Lu Su seemed like he wasn't willing to answer, so Lu Fei said, "I saw that he was heading towards the northwest, as if he was trying to find something, so I gave him a ride. How about you bring him back?" Hung Jun thanked Lu Fei, before asking Lu Su, "Where are you going?" Lu Su's expression seemed to be a little downcast as he pointed towards the northwest. At first, Hung Jun thought that he wanted to go home, but wasn't Lu Su's home already gone? After a long while, Hung Jun couldn't get a response. He felt that for Lu Su to leave so suddenly in the depths of the night meant that he definitely had something to hide, but he couldn't guess at Lu Su's thoughts at all. He could only wait until Emorigin and Li Jinglong arrived to get the specifics. "Tomorrow we'll go over slowly together," Hung Jun said. "We'll wait for them to catch up, Zhenji and Emorigin should already be on the way." Lu Fei then said, "You two squeeze together and manage for the night ba, I'll go stand guard." Lu Fei pushed open the door and went out. Hung Jun had chased after Lu Su for a whole night, and it was less than a shishan to dawn, so he was completely exhausted. He pulled the carpiao out, placing it by the stove, before lying down on the bed, saying, "You really made me search so hard." Hung Jun raised his hand to touch Lu Su's forehead, before lying down beside him, saying, "Don't be sad. Though I don't know what you're sad about, everything will get better eventually." Lu Su remained silent. He glanced at Hung Jun, who yawned. Hung Jun was already sleepy, and outside, the snow started to fall again. The cold wind started blowing, and its sobs gusted past the roof of the wooden house. The sound of the wind and the snow had a soporific effect. In that instant, a white light flashed, and Hung Jun felt that he had returned to the exorcism department, surrounded on all sides by unkempt weeds. Li Jinglong was currently holding the sword of wisdom, using it to draw a circle on the ground. "Don't stare off into space, draw quickly." Hung Jun looked around himself in confusion, only to see that Li Jinglong was gently pouring a ladleful of a blood-red pigment on the ground. "Which direction did they head in?" Li Jinglong asked. "Damn," Emorigin responded. "It's starting to snow." The snowflakes flew densely across the desolate plains, covering up the hoofprints. Under the flakes of snow that covered the sky, the only traces the two of them had left finally disappeared. Li Jinglong's heart burned with anxiety as he turned his horse's head, surveying the mountains all around them. Emorigin climbed off his horse, and with a shake, took the form of the grey wolf, sniffing a few times in the air. "You can smell his scent." The grey wolf's deep voice said. He brought Zhaozi along with him. "This way, let's go." The firewood in the stove was burning merrily as Hung Jun laid on the bed, his eyes closed. "Shuing," a familiar man's voice suddenly sounded. "Wake up." Hung Jun. Hung Jun didn't know how long he had slept. He sensed that his entire body felt terrible, his mouth was dry, his throat parched, and his entire body was hot to the touch. When he was called awake by this voice, he opened his eyes, only to see a young man, handsome beyond compare, sitting at his bedside, pressing the back of his hand against his forehead. Instantly, Hung Jun forgot about that snowy night and Lu Su, and he forgot about many other things. Countless memories, jumbled all together, poured into his mind, dragging him right back to when he was 7 years old. He struggled to sit up, but his head throbbed with great pain. "Kong Xian," a woman's voice called from outside. "Senior is awake. Time to eat your medicine," that man who had been addressed as Kong Xian said to Hung Jun. Hung Jun replied, "Dad, my head hurts so much." Kong Xian extended an arm and lifted Hung Jun up in his embrace. Hung Jun's entire body was weak and powerless, and he was so sick that he couldn't even lift his arms. "Drink the medicine," Kong Xian said in a quiet voice. Hung Jun felt terrible, and his consciousness was like glue. His head hurt so much it felt like there was a hammer knocking furiously on the inside of his head, trying to get out. He cried, "I won't drink the medicine." "Your illness will get better only when you drink the medicine." Kong Xian brought the bowl over, which was filled a little less than half with a concoction stewed bitter huanglian. Hung Jun fought down his discomfort and drank it, but his stomach suddenly churned, and not long after drinking it, he vomited it back up with a wah. "Kong Xian," the woman rushed in, saying angrily, "What medicine did you feed him now?" "A fever reducer." Kong Xian replied unhappily. "If he stays this ill, how will we set off tomorrow?" The woman's features were beautiful, but she was evidently tired, the color of her face had a tinge of white to it. She hurried forward to take Hung Jun into her arms, choking with sobs, her tears flowing down her face and landing on his ear. At her bosom, Hung Jun felt the warmth of her body and smelled the light, gentle fragrance on her. That feeling seemed to seep deep into his very bloodstream, causing him to begin to wail loudly, on the verge of tears. "Mom dash!" Jia Yuz held her son, sobbing so hard her voice was gone. But Kong Xian was extremely irritated by the crying of the mother and son, and he rose and roared, "It's me who's useless! It's me who's useless!" Hung Jun jolted from the shock. Though he had vomited up quite a lot of the medicine, what was left inside managed to take effect, and his head no longer hurt. "Where's Jinglong?" Hung Jun asked. "When Jinglong heard that you were sick, he brought a book for you," Jia Yu said. "Mom will bring it over for you." "Don't give it to him," Kong Xian said, his brow furrowed deeply. Jia Yuz passed by Kong Xian, not even looking at him, bringing the book over of her own accord and putting it by Hung Jun's bedside. The pages of the book had not yet fallen into disrepair, and Jia Yuz sat down at one side, saying quietly, "Mom will go tidy things up again. If you're tired, then sleep, be good." Hung Jun opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "Dad, I dreamed that I saw many graves." "It was a dream," Kong Xian replied, still frowning. "Don't be afraid, Dad's currently busy." The two of them then closed the door to the room and backed out. Hung Jun flipped through a few of the pages of the book, his expression confused and doubtful. He saw that on the last page, a black shadow had been drawn in with an ink brush, and to one side the word Mara was written. The door to the room was suddenly pushed open again, and Kong Xian entered once more. Little Hung Jun lifted his head and looked up as Kong Xian sat down on the side of the bed, asking, "Can you understand the words?" Hung Jun ned. Kong Xian continued, "Stop reading this book, It isn't anything good. And saying this, he handed him a piece of rock sugar and said, "Eat this." When Hung Jun saw the candy, he began to smile. He put the sugar into his mouth, sucking on it, and Kong Xian stroked his head, before leaning down and pressing a kiss to his forehead. Little Hung Jun noticed that the jade peacock plume that hung at his waist was exactly the same one that he himself carried around on his belt, so he reached out to touch it. But he never expected that Kong Xian would pull him firmly into his embrace, spasming with sobs. He focused all his efforts on stroking Hung Jun's head and face, vigorously kissing his eyebrows, saying quietly, "Senior, Dad apologizes to you." Hung Jun asked, "Dad, what's wrong?" Kong Xian sucked in a breath, shook his head, and closed his eyes before rising and once again leaving. It was very humid and hot both inside and outside, as it was a summer night, and the rain that had been looming had yet to fall. With a stagger, he clambered off his bed, his head spinning, feeling like he was treading over cotton. He pushed open the door and went out. It was night, and from the street outside came the sound of the woodblock. That was the Chang'an night that he was most familiar with, as the wooden G sounded on the ground, "Do-do." Not far away came the angered tones of Jia Yu's voice. His parents seemed to be arguing, so Hung Jun carefully crept over on bare feet. "I don't know who is tipping them off," Kong Xian said quietly. "Stop being so loud, Senior will hear." "Then why don't you tell me where we should go now?" Jia Yuz responded harshly. The main hall was filled with wooden trunks, bundles, and various other sundry items. His parents seemed to be in the middle of moving. Kong Xian was sitting on a trunk, and he sighed, saying, "I'll bring him back to Yejin Palace. Chongming won't just sit back and do nothing." "Those two brothers of yours only care about your life," Jia Yuz said, tears running down her face. "Kong Xian, when have they ever felt a single scrap of sympathy for us mother and son? When Senior was born, if it hadn't been for me risking my life to hold onto him, how would he still be alive today? Stop bringing up past debts," Kong Xian said in a low roar. "That was then, this is now. I'll send a letter to Yejin Palace. De Ge won't sit back and just watch as Senior loses his life." "What exactly is in his body?" Jia Yuz cried, her voice trembling. She took a step forward, her hair in disarray, evidently in great distress, yet doggedly asking Kong Xian questions even as she trembled. "Tell me, Kong Xian, I heard them say that you passed on the devil seed in your body to your son, isn't that right? To save your own life, you turned your own child into a sacrificial offering." Kong Xian fixed his gaze on Jia Yuz, saying, "Yuz, let me tell you this. If I had even half a thought of doing so, then may I be cast into hell, never to be redeemed. For thousands, millions of years, let me suffer in the black flames." Jia Yuz's hands pressed against her face as she let out trembling sobs. She almost fell over, and Kong Xian stepped forward to embrace her. "De Ge and Erge will come to pick us up," Kong Xian responded. "No. They won't come," Jia Yuz cried sorrowfully. "Otherwise they would never sit back and watch as you got hurt, nor would they stand by as all of them, one after the other, come to steal away Senior. I hate that I am not a Yao, otherwise, no matter if every bone in my body is shattered, I wouldn't let Senior live this kind of life." Kong Xian replied, as if he was begging for mercy, "Yuz, please stop, will you only be satisfied if I die right in front of you too?" "What use will that be?" Jia Yuz asked, sobbing. "I only wanted him to live happily like the other children. What has Senior done wrong? You tell me, the devil seed in his body, what exactly is it?" "Don't ask any more," Kong Xian replied. "We'll head out first thing tomorrow, and at worst, we'll go to Guazhou to find your older brother. In these past years, no matter where we fled, they would come chasing after us," Jia Yuz said. "The Yaoguai are everywhere, each of them looming with sharp teeth and claws, trying to take Xing'er away. Outside the hall, Hung Jun couldn't help but take a step back, his eyes filled with horror. He turned and stumbled at a run through the corridor, coming to a stop in the garden, his inner robe drenched with sweat. From behind, a jasmine flower suddenly flew at him, gently smacking into his head. Hung Jun whipped his head around, only to see a half-grown youth wearing a brocade robe curiously looking at him under the moonlight. "Seeing, are you feeling better?" That half-grown youth sat on the wall, one leg on either side, talking in a quiet voice to Hung Jun on the ground. "How come the color of your face looks so bad?" Hung Jun was a little at a loss for what to do. The sudden shock of overhearing his parents' words turned into a wave of distress that swept over him, causing him to cry without stopping. He had almost no way to fight back against this dreamscape that was as realistic as it could be, or perhaps these were memories. When that half-grown youth saw that Hung Jun was crying, he hurriedly said, Don't cry. What's wrong? If you cry, your dad will beat you again." He hurried to clamber quickly down the wall, and with his feet bare, he ran to Hung Jun, dropping to one knee on the ground, looking at him earnestly. The half-grown youth was already 9 years old, and though he wore a set of brocade robes, his face bore marks of having been whipped by a bamboo rod. With his sleeve, he wiped away Hung Jun's tears that would not stop flowing. Hung Jun, through the tears obscuring his sight, stared dumbly at him, those eyes and brows, that nose bridge, those lips. "Jinglong," Hung Jun called. "Call me Gage," 9-year-old Li Jinglong replied quietly, before grasping his hand in his own, saying, "Let's go." Li Jinglong took him, circling around the courtyard, before arriving in the flower garden in Hung Jun's home that was separated from the Li family's manor by a single fence. He had Hung Jun flip over it, before he climbed over afterwards. He then brought him through the corridor, heading towards the back courtyard, where a pomegranate tree was planted. Li Jinglong's family's estate was pretty big, and when they went into the hallway, there was a set of wooden G there, as well as a chess set laid out in front of the hallway. To one side was tossed a child-sized outer robe, and beside the chessboard was placed green pomegranates that hadn't yet ripened. Li Jinglong then went to get an outer robe, and he shook it out, having Hung Jun put it on. The clothes and the wooden G were both a little too large. He led Hung Jun straight into the room and got a pastry for him to eat, before feeling his forehead and mixing up some honey water for him to drink. He said, "You don't have a fever, huh?" The decorations in Li Jinglong's house were extremely luxurious, and during the day, he had even played chess against Hung Jun here, but as soon as Hung Jun went back, he got sick. Every time Jia Yuz moved, she never let Hung Jun play with the neighbors' children, so Hung Jun could only stay at home all day. Later, there was one time when he was seen by Li Jinglong, who felt that the 7 or 8 years old Hung Jun who had been locked up all alone at home was very pitiful, so he constantly climbed over the fence to visit him. End chapter. Legend of Exorcism. Chapter 60. Darkest Nightmare. Li Jinglong, a man's rough voice shouted angrily. "Where did you go now?" And following right after that was a series of heavy coughs. "Here, here, here," Li Jinglong said hurriedly. The two half-grown youths sat shoulder to shoulder under the eaves of the corridor, the weather humid and oppressive beyond belief. "I have to go," Hung Jun replied. "Go." Li Jinglong hadn't yet come back to himself fully. "I'm moving," Hung Jun said dejectedly. "But I haven't learned magic yet." Li Jinglong grew heated and said, "You promised you'd teach me." Hung Jun's gaze held some guilt as he lifted his head to look at Li Jinglong. Ever since he could remember, his parents always moved every year, and they had never stopped in one place for long. When he was 4, they had left Huayan to go to Luoyang, and then had left from Luoyang to Xiangyang when he was 5. They had moved to Shandong when he was 6, and when he was 7, they had moved here to Chang'an. Every time they went somewhere new, his mother always poured warnings into his ears that he was not allowed to play with the kids from other families. So Hung Jun could only stay at home every day, daydreaming as he stared at his father's medical books. 9-year-old Li Jinglong was the first friend that he had made last year, as well as his only friend. "Where are you moving to?" Li Jinglong asked. "I'll have my dad move too, we'll go together." "In my body, there is a Yaogwai," Hung Jun replied, not daring to look at Li Jinglong, one of his feet kicking the little wooden G gently. Li Jinglong instantly stopped making noise. Hung Jun turned his head. "They want to kill me." "Who?" Li Jinglong asked. Hung Jun shook his head. He didn't know who his opponents were, he only knew that his father was always heavily injured, and his mother always gathered him up in her embrace, crying. Because of him, their family had to suffer through who knows how many sleepless nights. "I am an inauspicious person," Hung Jun replied. "If the Yaogwai in my body gains life, you too will die." Li Jinglong watched him, completely still. Hung Jun felt strangely cold and calm, and he said, "I will remember you, Li Jinglong." He rose to leave, but Li Jinglong called him to a stop. "Tomorrow night, I will wait outside Jinchin's ward," Li Jinglong said. "Before you go, let's meet up one more time." Hung Jun found that a little odd, and he turned his head back to look at Li Jinglong. After thinking for a moment, he replied, "I will return the book to you." He then flipped over the wall, only to hear the person on the other side shouting, "Hung Jun." Hung Jun stood there dumbly for a while, and for some unknown reason, he began to grow anxious. He walked towards his own room, but suddenly a bolt of lightning flashed across the sky, and thunder pealed. That flash of light blinded him to the point where he couldn't open his eyes. Hung Jun. Hung Jun looked around him, the scenery had changed, and he was now standing in a small alleyway. The scenes from before when he had entered the dream realm were currently coming back to him. In his hand, he held the book that Li Jinglong had lent him, only to hear a shout from all around, "Hung Jun! Hung Jun!" In the long night, the lightning flashed again and again, and Li Jinglong's voice shouted loudly in front of him, "Hung Jun dash!" Hung Jun began to run, but Li Jinglong was waiting for him right at the entrance to the alleyway. "Li Jinglong?" Hung Jun asked. Li Jinglong reached a hand out to grab him, but Hung Jun suddenly felt a stab of horror, and he dodged that hand. "Trust me." "Hung Jun. When have I ever lied to you?" Li Jinglong said anxiously. "Come with me." Li Jinglong grabbed his hand, dragging him along as they raced along the alley. At the end of the alley was an unlatched wooden door, and he pushed it open, bringing Hung Jun into a desolate front courtyard overgrown with weeds. "This is," Hung Jun said, confused. "Li Jinglong. What are you doing?" The lightning flashed overhead, and Hung Jun slowed in his steps, finding that he had walked into the courtyard of the exorcism department. In the courtyard, a golden statue was shining with light, and in that instant, that light exploded outwards, trapping him within its midst with a wang. "Let me out!" Hung Jun cried, tossing the book to the side. The Li Jinglong of their childhood stood in the front hall, and behind him was a warrior clad in golden armor that emitted a golden radiance. "I brought him," Li Jinglong said, panting heavily. "That's him." Hung Jun roared, infuriated, "You lied to me." The warrior spoke with a deep, ancient voice. "Seed of Mara, in the coming days, a great catastrophe will arise because of you. Even if I kill an innocent today, I must end your life." That warrior wielded a golden sword in his hand, and the magical array suddenly boomed, spewing out white flames. In the array, Hung Jun kept slamming himself against it, shouting loudly, "Li Jinglong dash!" In that instant, time seemed to speed up in a flash, and Li Jinglong's body gradually grew large and broad, but Hung Jun kept shrinking smaller and smaller. He watched his own hands, shocked, as they returned to the size that they were when he was 4, before he suddenly began to sprout upwards as well, returning to his 16-year-old build. Li Jinglong! Hung Jun cried. The flames of the array reflected in Li Jinglong's eyes, while Hung Jun's entire body was emitting black chi as he shouted painfully and wildly. The golden flames burned through his skin, causing fresh blood to seep out over his entire body, and at this point, his hair was already loose and in disarray as he was burned to the point of becoming a figure covered in blood. Li Jinglong! From Hung Jun's throat came a muffled scream. His heart was currently spewing black flames that seemed as if they could cover the sky, but that golden warrior sheathed the long sword in his hand, 6 glowing magical weapons appearing around him. In the next moment, the artifacts spun around, merging into one, turning into a huge bow. Right after the golden warrior floated towards Li Jinglong, and with a wang, the two of them melded into one. Dad! Mom! Hung Jun knelt in the array, the features of his face already burnt beyond recognition, a horrific voice issuing from his throat, pleading, "Save me, it hurts so much, ah!" Trembling, Li Jinglong drew his long bow, aiming directly for little Hung Jun in the midst of the array. In the next instant, the great doors of the exorcism department collapsed inward, the wooden doors falling as if they had been leveled by a flood. Kong Xian flashed by so quickly he turned into a blur, rushing into the array, meeting head-on the arrow that left the golden warrior's bowstring. Kong Xian spread open the pentacolor sacred light, facing down the arrow shaft that had been fired from the 6 artifacts that had turned into one, charging ahead. But in the next moment, the arrow of light easily shattered the pentacolor sacred light, burying itself in Kong Xian's chest. Jia Yuz rushed into the array, her hair in disarray, hugging Hung Jun who had already been charred by the flames, letting out a heart-rending wail. Kong Xian roared, "Derenja dash!" Kong Xian had rushed in front of Derenja, but he couldn't refrain from lowering his head, looking down at the shaft of the arrow that had half buried itself in his chest. Jia Yuz's tears flowed down as she hugged Hung Jun, one hand stroking the side of his face, murmuring, "Senior, don't be afraid, it's okay, it's okay." "Mom, it hurts," Hung Jun said, his voice trembling. Immediately, the corners of his mouth split, and bloody froth spewed forth from his mouth. His throat was already blocked up by the blood. "It won't hurt anymore, very soon, it won't hurt anymore," Jia Yuz murmured, her entire face wet with tears. "Burn away my spirit, scatter my soul." Hung Jun's body shrank incessantly. Jia Yuz closed her eyes, tears flowing out from their corners as she chanted a spell. One hand glowed with green light as she pressed it against Hung Jun's face. The skin over Hung Jun's entire body swiftly healed, renewing itself again and again. As if he was shedding a skin, after his charred outer shell split and fell off, it was replaced with whole, unmarred skin. As that spell took effect, Jia Yuz's waterfall of black hair instantly turned to snow, going completely white. Her face became that of an old woman's. "Derenja," Jia Yuz sobbed. "Spare my senior ba, what has he done wrong?" Kong Xian had been shot through the chest by that golden arrow, but still he struggled to rise, only to almost fall to his knees in the courtyard. Jia Yuz went forward to support him, kneeling together with him in front of Li Jinglong. Kong Xian said, his voice trembling, "Derenja, I only have this one child." Hung Jun dragged along the oversized clothing that he had on when his body had shrunken to child size. Horror appeared in his eyes, and he lifted his gaze to look towards the golden warrior holding the sword of wisdom in one hand. "Dad." "Mom," Hung Jun sat on his knees on the ground, his voice trembling as he spoke. He slowly lifted his head, a look like that of dead ashes appearing in his gaze as he met Li Jinglong's eyes. Li Jinglong trembled as he lifted his arm, white light glowing from his palm. Hung Jun let out an angered cry. "Dad." The black energy in his body once again exploded, a multitude of demonic silhouettes rising from the ground. The black tide rushed outwards in all directions, instantly enveloping the entire city of Chang'an. The exorcism department, Jinchinj Ward, Chang'an, and even the entirety of the Central Plains collapsed under the rush of this wave. Its citizens, and all living beings, were swept up by this black qi, as if a powerful whirlwind had sprung into being. Li Jinglong faced that whirlwind, shouting angrily, "Hung Jun!" The black whirlwind seemed to have swallowed up everything. With the sword of wisdom in his right hand and white light shining from his left, Li Jinglong split apart the sky above and the earth below. "Wake up!" Li Jinglong roared, before he pulled Hung Jun into his lap. White light exploded outwards, saturating Hung Jun's entire form. That bright light seemed to radiate through his soul, and it began to burn. That pain returned once again, and he began to struggle with all his might, screaming, "Let go of me!" "He's awake!" Amorigin roared. "Zenchi! He's awake!" The white light instantly retreated, and the world returned to its grey dimness. Hung Jun's consciousness was greatly shaken, as if it had been subject to a deafening peal of thunder, and Li Jinglong hugged him tightly. Hung Jun held one pair of throwing knives in each hand, fighting with all his might to turn his face upwards and look towards the sky above. The light of the wintry silver river above reflected in his eyes as he craned his neck backwards. Amorigin stood on the snowy ground, his body covered with wounds, panting. Li Jinglong's hair was loose and unbound, and there was fresh blood all over his face. He hugged Hung Jun tightly, refusing to loosen his grip. All around them were fallen corpse ghosts that fell in battle. Lu Fei laid on the ground, and the little hut had already been completely destroyed. Countless war horses were laid out on the ground. Corpses were strewn everywhere across the ice and in the graveyard. Li Jinglong stood in the snow, hugging Hung Jun, while a large patch of the snow under their feet had already been dyed the purple-black of blood. "You lied to me," Hung Jun murmured, before he lost consciousness, collapsing into Li Jinglong's embrace. The grey wolf carried Li Jinglong and Lu Fei, while Li Jinglong hugged the unconscious Hung Jun in his arms, as they raced towards the end of the valley. In his exhaustion, Hung Jun had a very, very long dream. In his dream, Li Jinglong chased after the horse cart to see him off, shoving the book into his hands. "You couldn't wait until the pomegranates ripened," Li Jinglong shouted. "Plant it in your new house, ba." Hung Jun stuck his head out, his tears flowing down his cheeks as he said, "We'll meet again someday, Li Jinglong." Li Jinglong stood at the end of the alleyway, wiping away his tears now and then as he shouted, "Wait for me to learn magic. I'll go find you." Shooing. A man's voice sounded by his ear. Hung Jun slowly woke, only to find that he seemed to have returned to the house in his dream. He looked dazedly towards the person sitting by his bedside, subconsciously reaching out to feel around by his body, where he felt warm, soft blankets. "You're awake," the man sitting by his bedside said. "He's awake. Quickly, bring Li Zhenqi over." "Where is this place?" Hung Jun asked. He lifted his arm, only to see that his body hadn't changed at all, and this was still his body. "Am I still dreaming?" That man's face seemed a little familiar as he stared fixedly at Hung Jun. "I'm your uncle, Shuing," the man said. The door opened very violently, and Li Jinglong rushed in like a gust of wind, asking, "Hung Jun?" Amorigin also entered. The Carpiao followed at the end, shouting, "Hung Jun! Are you all right? What happened?" Hung Jun's head began to hurt again as he continued to ask questions. "Where is this?" Amorigin stroked Hung Jun's forehead and quietly uttered a spell, and Hung Jun's headache slowly dissipated. Li Jinglong also came forward to stroke his forehead, but Hung Jun still remembered the events of that dream, and with horror in his eyes, he dodged that hand. "Shuing," the man sitting by his bedside said. "Do you still remember me?" "I am Jiazhou." Hung Jun fixed his stare on that man. He had no memory of this person anymore, but his features were very similar to the mother in his dreams. "Do you remember me?" Li Jinglong asked. Hung Jun nodded, before looking at Emorigin and also nodding. The Carpiao also squeezed its head in, asking, "How about me, how about me?" After confirming that he was no longer dreaming, Hung Jun used his index finger to gently poke the Carpiao a few times. It hopped onto the bed, and Hung Jun continued to stare at that strange man by his bedside. "Do you remember him?" Li Jinglong asked earnestly. "He is the prefect of Guazhu, Jiazhou, your mother Jia Yu's older brother." "This isn't right," Jiazhou said. "Seeing shouldn't you be 19 this year? And these looks, you look as if you and Kong Xian sprang out of the same mold, what a strange occurrence indeed," and saying this, he actually began to chuckle. With this, Hung Jun finally remembered. That day on the carriage, Yang Yahuan had told him that his mother had a brother, and his maternal grandpa had once held the role of a vice-judushi, and ever since, his mother's side of the family stayed in Hexi. "Yes, you and my mother look very alike." Hung Jun observed Jiazhou's face. Jiazhou was already over 40 years old, and when he heard these words, he began to smile. He wiped his tears and held Hung Jun's hand in his own, his hand covered with calluses from his many years in the army. "Why did it take you so long to come?" Jiazhou asked. "After your mother and father died, who raised you? Back then, when I heard that your parents were gone, I sent people everywhere to search for." Instantly, the color of Hung Jun's face changed, and he sat there, staring off into space for a bit. He lifted his eyes to look at Li Jinglong, who noticed that his expression wasn't quite right and asked, "What's wrong?" At that, Hung Jun was a little at a loss for what to say. Emorigin answered, "I imagine he's tired, let's let him rest for a bit." The Carpiao observed Hung Jun, saying, "The color of his face is too poor." "Let the uncle and nephew reminisce on the past first," Li Jinglong said, understanding. "Hung Jun, you rest well. If there's anything, call me at any time, I'm staying just over in the eastern wing." Hung Jun didn't say anything, so Li Jinglong sent a glance at Jiazhou. Jiazhou nodded, understanding, and Li Jinglong and Emorigin then left. The Carpiao said, "I won't disturb you, Hung Jun, you can just pretend that I'm not here." And saying this, the Carpiao headed towards the corner of the room, slipping into a small wooden basin. Only Hung Jun and Jiazhou were left in the room. Hung Jun thought for a bit, before he moved to rise off the bed, only for Jiazhou to say, "Don't hurry to move, you haven't eaten anything for several days now." Jiazhou went outside and issued a few commands, and with that, a servant brought over some thick rice gruel. "This name was what uncle gave you," Jiazhou said, lifting the rice stew and feeding it to Hung Jun. Hung Jun replied, "I'll do it myself." "Be careful, it's hot," Jiazhou said. Hung Jun took the bowl, his mind still filled with what had happened in the dreamscape. Facing Jiazhou, he had no way to avoid thinking about that dream, and upon seeing his uncle who bore a close resemblance to his mother, he kept ending up thinking about his mother who had hugged him in his dream. He downed the rice stew in big gulps, feeling a little bit of his strength come back to him. He then turned his eyes to Jiazhou, saying, "My mom was Jia Yu's." "Your dad was Kong Xian," Jiazhou replied, smiling. "A divine doctor who could bring the dead back to life, who practiced medicine to help the people." Hung Jun breathed lightly, reaching a hand out to grope around on the bed. Seeing that, Jiazhou pulled out that jade peacock plume from under the pillow, saying, "Your guys Zenchi brought you here to Yumen, before requesting help in asking after." "We've already reached Yumen?" Hung Jun asked, astonished. "We ran this far? When I chased Lu Su for a single night, we hadn't yet reached Zhangjai." "You all seem to have run into many things on the way here," Jiazhou replied. "Don't be hasty, talk about them slowly, one at a time." But just at this time, a military report arrived, so Jiazhou rose to leave, telling him that as soon as he had the time, he would come to see him. With that, he took his leave temporarily. In the next room, Li Jinglong wanted to lie down, but as soon as he turned his body, his mouth widened in a grimace of pain. Amorigin sat behind the table, watching the snow drifting in the courtyard. I keep feeling that Hung Jun's off, Li Jinglong said. That gaze that he used to look at me was like he had just woken from a nightmare. I've already called him back from within the dream. You at least can find him, Amorigin said anxiously. We still don't know where Lu Su is. Li Jinglong replied comfortingly, Jia Zhou's scouts have already been sent out to search, and Lu Fei is also searching. He'll be all right. Amorigin asked, what exactly happened that night? Zhao Zilong didn't explain clearly. Li Jinglong replied, only by asking Hung Jun will we know. Amorigin said, but you didn't let me ask. Are you insane? Li Jinglong roared loudly. Amorigin could only stop speaking. Hung Jun had just recovered from his illness, and seeing that he was still a little dazed, there was no way they could question him now. But Lu Su's whereabouts were uncertain, and Amorigin couldn't sit still. Li Jinglong asked, why didn't you act without authorization and head out to find him? Could you add any more trouble for me to deal with? Li Jinglong was like the parent of the exorcism department. Although Amorigin was older than him by 2 years, he still had to listen to him. What exactly happened to Hung Jun? Li Jinglong asked, furrowing his brow. He's a half Yao, Amorigin responded. There was a cluster of evil energy in him, I don't know if it had been suppressed before by some seal of his adoptive fathers. Saying this, he rose, pacing within the room as he continued, he was unable to differentiate between enemy and friend, attacking at random, like he had sunk into a nightmare. You could see his dream? Li Jinglong asked. Amorigin shook his head. I can only wake him. Only the white deer can cause him to sleep and enter his dreamscape. In the guest room, Hung Jun sat behind the table, placing the basin that held the carpiao on it. What exactly happened on this journey? The carpiao said, Hung Jun, you really can't remember anything at all. Speak, quickly now, Hung Jun said, furrowing his brow as he watched the carpiao. The carpiao was a little hesitant as it said, all right ba, Zhenqi told me not to tell you, he was afraid that when you heard it. Hung Jun replied, I won't say a single word. The carpiao's expression was secretive, its hands slung over the side of the basin as its head stuck out, looking at Hung Jun. Finally, it began to explain. As it turned out, that night, Hung Jun chased Lu Su and Lu Fei to a graveyard. After entering the little house, they took a short rest and decided to spend the night there, but the carpiao too didn't sense anything strange. But in the middle of the night, Hung Jun woke, and as if he was sleepwalking, he slowly walked to the middle of the graveyard. When Li Jinglong and Amorigin had caught up, Hung Jun, like a puppet with broken strings and his entire body emitting black qi, actually attacked Li Jinglong and Amorigin. Lu Su was wearing a set of black robes, and he floated into the air behind Hung Jun, millions of threads sprouting from his hands, controlling Hung Jun's every move. And the Lu Fei outside the wooden hut changed forms with a swish of his body, becoming a woman clad in all black, her entire face pitch black. Li Jinglong and Amorigin naturally rushed forward to rescue him, but the black-robed woman called up an icy wind and heavy snow, which enveloped the graveyard and the plains. That was the other Yaoguai, Suanu. Hung Jun asked. The carpiao responded, I don't know. Amorigin and Li Jinglong covered for each other's weaknesses as they fought together against this danger, but Suanu's icy wind was too strong. They couldn't approach at all as ice spikes and heavy snow flew at them from all directions, while Hung Jun, standing in the snow and ice, began his all-out, demon lord-like assault. Thankfully, the real Lu Fei had coincidentally returned just then, and with the wind sword, called up the soldiers that had been sleeping for a long time in those graves. Amorigin ignored the frostbite and fought Suanu, who was wounded in the clash and fled. Right after, Li Jinglong used the heart lamp to break through the control that Lu Su had over Hung Jun. Hung Jun suddenly remembered that in his dream, he had only seen a flash of light, but not heard a peal of thunder. Perhaps that frequent flashing had been the heart lamp. And then Lu Su vanished, the Carpiao said. Before he left, he said some harsh words in parting. Hung Jun widened his eyes. It's written in your destiny that one day, you will die under his hands. Since the devil seed has already been found, in the coming days, just wait for the storm to arrive. End chapter.